Basically, language is this phenomenal nexus of culture and grammar and semiotics, and it's so complicated and so engaged with who we are, with our identity, this identity that we've constructed, that we don't survive well without it, especially those of us who've learned a language. If we were forced to start speaking another language right now and never be able to use our native language, which is the case of many people in the world, it would be devastating to our psyche.
Welcome to The Story of Language, an original podcast series about language, linguistics, cognition, and culture. My name is Christian Saunders, and I'm an English teacher, and throughout this series I will be in discussion with Dan Everett, linguist, anthropologist, philosopher, and author. In this episode, we talk about endangered languages. I ask why languages are important, what is lost when a language disappears, the cultural and economic factors behind language loss, and the truth about the best way to stop languages from disappearing. If you would like to contact us, you can find us on Twitter at Story of Language, or you can send us an email at storyoflanguage@gmail.com. This is episode 9 of The Story of Language. A few years ago, I was asking myself the serious question, why is it important to protect other languages? And I was out at a bar having drinks with a teacher who teaches Galician, which is the local language here, and I asked her a genuine question. I wasn't trying to be rude or anything. My genuine question was, well, if Galician disappeared one day, I don't really see the problem, because you can just speak Spanish or just speak English and you will still be able to communicate. And she got really offended by the question. And since then, I still have curiosity about this question. I'm wondering how you feel about the need to protect languages.
I mean, I think one way to ask it is, what difference would it make to us if English disappeared and we were forced to learn Chinese? When I was a translator, a Bible translator, the motivation behind that was that even if you spoke other languages, your emotions and your deepest feelings were expressed in your native language. But if you had another native language, that would be fine. Endangered languages, and all languages represent to us, are the equivalent of enormous libraries of information that has been accumulated over time through the deep experiences of a people and a culture. It's not just that we lose a particular computational code for getting the same thoughts across, but that we have, through our languages, classified nature in a particular way. We have encoded all of our experiences of a rich ancient culture in that language, and its loss is irreplaceable. So not only do we feel in the language of our mothers, but those languages account for aggregated information that is of great importance to people who want to understand our species, and not merely the languages themselves. There's a lot more in an endangered language than just the language.
Well, I'd definitely like to get a little bit deeper into that shortly. But, I mean, of course, I totally agree that kind of obligating adult, speakers who already have a first or a second language, obligating them to learn a new language because their original language dies out, I understand that's a different case. But I'm thinking about more, when languages die off over generations, for example, maybe this will happen here where I live, that in 10 generations, Galician will die and everyone will speak Spanish. And, I was genuinely curious about what would be lost by that if the point of language is just communication.
Well, again, what would be lost is all the ways of, so for example, in some languages, there's information about, in the very words and in expressions that are used, about agricultural cycles or calendars or ways of keeping track of time, different numerical possibilities. And when these are lost, even though the speakers are still communicating fine, all the knowledge of that language that was encoded in the very language itself is gone. And so this can't be replaced. On the other hand, people decide to switch languages for a variety of reasons. The most powerful one, in my experience, is economic. So if the children don't find economic advantage in speaking their parents' language, chances are they won't. And you see this in any time of immigration. When Italians and Germans came to the U.S., a major part of the early U.S. population, Irish and others, their children didn't continue speaking their native languages, their parents' native languages. They switched to English because the economic advantages were all in speaking English. I mean, that's a huge part of it. That's one of the concerns I have with a lot of the revitalization efforts. There are very few stories of successful language revitalization in the world. Once it's lost, aside from Hebrew and a couple of other cases, it's pretty much lost.
Well, this is something else I really wanted to talk about. And in fact, I saw some research recently that showed that after just 3 generations of Spanish immigrants living in America, only 3% of them could speak Spanish or understand Spanish. So I think it's shocking how quickly it happens, like in the case of emigration or immigration.
Well, when I went to, in elementary school, 70% of my school was probably Spanish speaking in the home in Southern California on the Mexican border. But all of my friends who were Mexican Americans spoke perfect English. I mean, the thing that used to shock me when we were playing football or something is they would switch to Spanish, and I didn't know what the hell they were doing, and I really wanted to know. I felt like they had a real leg up on me cognitively. I mean, they could speak anything I could say, plus they could say all this other stuff. But I don't think that the motivation to continue Spanish another generation or two is really there. You see it. I mean, all the friends I went to school with still speak Spanish fluently, but I don't know how many of their children do.
So, if we could just go back a little bit to talk about this knowledge that's contained in languages, and you sort of mentioned a few things specifically, like maybe specific ways of doing agriculture or things like that. But is because a lot of that knowledge is obviously ancient, perhaps, as you said, encoded in the language from generations. Has a lot of that information, is it not kind of superseded by, I don't know, by modern science? Like is that information still valuable to us?
Oh, yes. I mean, David Harrison, in his books on endangered languages, has documented several cases of knowledge that has not been superseded. But if you take the Piraha, for example, in the Amazon, they know the name of every plant and animal that's in the Amazon. And I have, I have gotten words for them that I didn't understand. And then when I finally figured it out, it was an animal that was claimed to be extinct for over almost 100 years. And they brought me one to show that it's not extinct. So all of this knowledge is lost if they just suddenly switch to Portuguese. All this ability to talk about these plants, the flora and fauna of the Amazon, and I'm forgetting forget the literature, the poetry, all of these things are vital. And if it's an oral culture, you lose all of this. You lose all these stories. You lose all these beliefs and ways of dealing with grief and dealing with the problems of our species. But you lose just factual knowledge that if Piraha weren't spoken tomorrow, then that entire region of the jungle, we would have huge knowledge gaps. If people would take the time to write down what the Piraha know. I mean, I've done a lot, but I'm not an ethnozoologist, and I haven't taken the time to do some of the other research that would be interesting. But this knowledge is encoded in their language. It will never be superseded. I mean, unless scientists speaking Portuguese or English learn all these plants and animals and all their functions, but they're not going to do that from one day to the next. This knowledge has been aggregated over generations.
We were talking a little bit about this during the episode about linguistic relativity, about how it seems that maybe humans, and not just humans, but all animals, have certain categories that just seem to be maybe, well, I mean, I hate to use the word innate, but for example, we don't put birds and trees in the same category. We know that somehow they're different. But, for example, do the Pirahan perhaps put things together or separate things in a way that we wouldn't in English?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is very common. There was a doctoral dissertation done at the university in Brazil that I taught at, Unicamp, back in the 80s when I was there, on ethno-ornithology, it was a combination linguistics biology PhD. And he showed that the system of bird classification among the YMP is very different from the kinds of classifications used by Western ornithologists. So birds were not classified based on their anatomy, but based on the food they ate. And this was very interesting. So that whole classes of birds that were found by the people to eat the same kinds of seeds, to use the same kind of environment, were classified together as what we would call a species. We've chosen anatomy and more recently evolutionary history to be the basis for classifying animals, but they chose behavior instead of innate physiological characteristics. And this leads to, so you can't know where to put a bird unless you know what it eats and where it lives and that sort of thing. And if you need to eat birds to make a living, that's great information to have, and it's built right into the language.
Wow, that that actually, I suppose, just exposed a massive kind of cognitive bias that I have towards classifying animals, based on, as you said, based on their physiology. Whereas that's just an arbitrary classification, really, isn't it?
You can use any number of classifications. What's useful to you? I mean, we want to know certain things that our classification reveals to us. And research on the evolutionary history of animals is aided by a classification that groups them physiologically. But if that's not your interest, if your interest is in knowing how to find them and knowing what they'll taste like and these sorts of things, you're going to use a totally different system of classification. And it takes a huge amount of knowledge to come up with this system.
You said something earlier about how a lot of these languages, especially very small languages, in kind of remote places, they've never been written down. And this, to me, the question becomes, well, does that not mean that a lot of information has kind of been already lost because, maybe certain generations just don't pass on certain types of knowledge? Are cultures that have writing at an advantage when it comes to knowing stuff?
Oral histories, the Bible, for example, was for centuries simply transmitted orally. A lot of the founding, stories of religions that are written today, and also knowledge of medicine, these things were transmitted orally. But for the Piraha, in which every day requires interaction with nature and hunting and fishing and classification, this knowledge is just as strong as it has always been, because children are learning from their parents when they go out there. And in fact, when they ask me the names for things, such as they'll give me the name for a plant in their culture, and they'll tell me what it's used for. So they'll show me one vine and say, this is the name of this is X. And then they tell me that if I beat this vine and get the fibers really exposed and put it in the water, it will release a chemical that will deprive the fish of oxygen, and they'll come to the top and you can scoop them up. And everybody knows this, and they ask me what it is, and I have, just in English, I call it a vine. And every vine that they show me, I just call it a vine. And this is just bizarre to them that I don't know that. It's like calling every red thing a tomato.
Oh, I suppose it is exactly like that. And I mean, sometimes I question my own usefulness as an individual in the modern world, because, I think in a modern world, in a big society, you have so many specialist kind of roles. And for example, if I was to be the last human on Earth for some reason, like, I have no idea how escalators work. I have no idea how to do kind of like, I wouldn't know how to make electricity and do all of this stuff that I just take for granted. I don't have that knowledge personally.
No, I mean, if you watch any of the survival programs like Alone, I mean, I like to watch some of these survival programs because, I had to do that for so long. And, people get the idea, I'll make a little boat. Well, it's really, really complicated to do that. A canoe like the people make takes a long process and lots of knowledge of wood and its properties and which wood is best. And there's all kinds of knowledge. Richardson and Boyd, two anthropologists whose work has been extremely influential in my thinking and that of many others, just talked about all the knowledge that exists in, say, a kayak. You cannot build a kayak just by looking at one. You need a lot of instruction and a lot of experience to do that. But it looks simple, right? Just some wood with some skin tied across it. But all this knowledge is encoded in the language and transmitted by oral tradition. And in our own societies, we don't know how to make, our societies are so technologically complex that we don't know how to make a computer. We don't know how to make headphones. We don't know how to make paper. We don't know how to make pencils. I just bought a book on the history of paper, and I mean, we learn a little bit about this in school, but I still think the most important technological achievement in the history of our species is the book. And there's a huge amount of technology to making a book. And it's the one place that you can read sustained arguments about specific topics and come away with a fairly complete knowledge of that topic. You can't get it from movies. Yeah, we all depend on each other. The society in which we're born is fundamental to our knowledge of the world.
I'm kind of wondering now, thinking more about what you're saying, I'm wondering if in fact, small kind of tribal groups who they maybe have more limited knowledge, but they have more knowledge about things that are necessary for survival. It's probably more likely that, in a catastrophic event, that they're the ones that are going to survive, and all of us with all of our technology are not going to do very well at all.
I mean, if all technology were ended tomorrow, hunter-gatherer groups would not even be affected. All electronic-based technology, they would be fine. I was just thinking the other day that, when I used to spend more than a year at a time without news of the outside world among the Pitahas in the Amazon, wouldn't that be nice right now? I would just be there eating fish as normal. I wouldn't know about this pandemic. It would never come there and affect me. I mean, it's highly unlikely that it would be there. The only way they're going to get it is if some idiot white person takes it to them. And that will happen. I mean, it happened throughout the Americas. It's happened in lots of places. Every person knows how to make what every other person makes. So there's nobody in the Pitaha, for example, who is known for making things that are in need throughout the society that nobody else can make. So there's no economy from specialized knowledge because everybody has the same knowledge. It's possible because they get by at a much simpler level. They don't need the level of technology that we do to have the same to be successful in their environment. And that's something that we're so specialized.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I've seen some criticisms by some kind of modern philosophers saying that that as a generation, the rich industrialized Western people, as a generation, we are putting too much of our knowledge and too much of our memories and I don't know, we're putting too much, let's say, thinking onto external devices. Like, when we want to know something, we Google it, we save our pictures in the cloud. And, maybe all of this stuff is so vulnerable to just being lost. And then without it, maybe we're kind of externalizing too much of our culture.
Yes, I mean, this is the extended mind hypothesis, and I think there's some truth into it, that we do offload our memory onto technology. Some experiments show that oral cultures, that people tend to remember more complex stories longer and better. I mean, if you tell there still is the fact, in terms of working memory, short term, George Miller showed that we really can't remember much more than 7 things. He did this research for the telephone, for Bell Telephone, and that's why they started putting the area code in parentheses. So they have a 4-digit number and then a 3-digit number, which is separate. So you learn a 3-digit and a 4-digit thing instead of a 7-digit thing, because you'd probably forget it. But even so, if you tell somebody your phone number, they can't. They have to ask you like 2 or 3 times to get those 7 numbers. People aren't used to just hearing it and writing it down, or hearing it and remembering it without writing it down. And so these are skills that have to be developed. It's just like if you are, if you're blind, you pay more attention to the input from your other senses. At least I'm told, never having been blind. But if you don't write your language, you're going to have to pay attention to the non-visual channel. I mean, writing is also an offloading of our oral language to a visual channel, and that's sign language does that too. So all of our senses are available to us, but when we offload our memory responsibilities to technology, then we are, unless we're remembering other things, which I don't know that we are failing to exercise our brains.
So, because you talked a little bit about the possibility, well, the remote possibility that the Pitaha could come in contact with, a virus or an infection from outside, and when it comes to something like a virus, there's sort of clear steps in order to protect the people. But I'm wondering about what do you think is the best way to protect the extinction of languages?
Well, the pessimistic perspective, which I have on always, is that there's really nothing you can do, because economics is going to drive everything, and as it always has in the Western world, it is going to be this way around the world. So that, if you find valuable minerals on the Pitaha's land, if somebody does, that's the end of them. They are going to be lost, because no law will protect them if there's a lot of wealth on their land. We see that even in the United States. American Native peoples, First Nations of the United States, are protesting constantly about pipelines and exploitation of minerals on their land, and this is not going to avail them of much, because economics is the most powerful force. So on the one hand, I'm very pessimistic. I think most of these languages will be gone in a generation. On the other hand, there are some things you can do, and that is to not wall them off, but protect their lands to the degree that they want their lands protected. I mean, I can't tell nobody has the right to tell one society or culture that they should not have contact with the outside world, that their children should not learn the national language, that they should not take jobs in the cities. I mean, if you can talk to them, perhaps if they want to hear your advice, you can talk to them about the dangers in that and how they might be exploited. as a people. But ultimately, you can prevent outside people from going in. You can help them learn more about the world so that they can make their choices. But for example, the Pitahans were always asking me for motorboats because I had a motorboat. It's not as much work to ride a couple of days in a motorboat as it is to paddle for a couple of days in a canoe. So they naturally wanted to avail themselves of this. And I tried to explain to them that it wouldn't do any good for me to buy them a motorboat because they wouldn't be able to purchase the gasoline. They wouldn't be able to repair the motor. It doesn't fit into their culture. This didn't make them happy at first, but eventually the Brazilian Indian Agency, through a particular individual, got them a bunch of motorboats. And they were happy as they could be, while he was providing the gasoline from the government. Actually, it was diesel fuel. It was a different kind of motor, but eventually he left, and the purpose that he had for introducing these boats to them to get their support for something was gone. So he stopped buying the fuel. So now if you ride down that way, you'll see along their river, you'll see these sunken motorboats in different places because they're useless to them. And so this could be a motive for them to go out of the village to get jobs so that they can buy these sorts of things. This has certainly motivated a lot of people to leave their culture and leave their language and become more enculturated into the national culture. But for the Pitahans, still the pull of their own culture and language has been too strong. So no Pitahan, in spite of all of this, has ever left the village to live permanently in the city.
It seemed like you were putting geography at the top of the list of important ways to protect the language, and I'm wondering, is that right? Like, is geographical separation kind of one of the key things you can do to protect these languages?
Well, for the kinds of languages I work on, yes, it's not going to be feasible for Galician because you can't put a wall in Spain to keep the Galician speakers on one side. But for hunter-gatherers, you're not talking about a wall either. You're simply saying that entry into their areas has to be better protected. And so I think it's very important. In terms of if you take a more, like Portuguese, Portuguese is, depending on the count, the fifth most widely spoken language in the world. Is that language going to disappear? No, everybody who speaks, there's so many people who speak Portuguese, but it's not the language it once was. It used to be the trade language of the world. When Portugal under Henry the Navigator was sailing all around the world, the Portuguese kings were some of the most powerful, and Portuguese language was the language of trade. And then after that came French and other languages. Before that was Greek, and then Latin, and Portuguese, French, English for now, could be Mandarin in the future. English almost died out. In the 12th century, the English language was highly endangered, and because of the French rule, and we were basically losing English to French, and our language was forever changed. We went from being German to being a pidgin language, just a cross between French and German and some other things, so it's a very, very bizarre situation that but now, of course, English is the flavor of the month, but it's economics that determines these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, I never thought about it in such stark terms, but there does seem to be a very strong correlation. So what about perhaps a language that has a small number of speakers, but they're in a big city, or they're near a big city, so they're often in contact with speakers of a majority language. What can they do to try and help the language to survive for generations? Is it a question of, doing what you said before, like, maybe we do have to force people to speak it. Maybe we have to be aggressively, forceful.
Yeah, you can try that. You can have classes, but these things don't tend to work very much. I mean, the reverse was used in Brazil by some Salesian missionaries who still today, in the villages in which they work, prohibit the indigenous peoples from speaking their own languages. I talked to a priest who said very proudly that every time he heard somebody speaking an indigenous language in his mission, he hit him right in the mouth to remind them that that's not good for them to speak their language. Well, when you're constantly running down their language and tell them that God doesn't speak that language and he's not interested in it, and that nobody else cares about it either, well, that can have negative effects. If you're trying to tell people they have to speak their language when they see that all the radio stations and television stations are in another language and the jobs are not in their language, you can make it available to them. You can talk to them about pride and the preservation of knowledge and carrying on their parents' traditions. But in my experience and reading, I just don't, people give their lives to this sort of thing. So I don't want to denigrate what they're doing, but I don't think it's effective in the long run.
I don't know about any research about this subject, but, my instinct viewing the way that even really keen adult learners fail to sustain the motivation to learn English, which is something that they might really need for work or really need for travel or whatever. I think it's probably the same difficulty that you encounter, which is just that, language is really hard, and if you don't have an actual use for it, then it's a lot of effort for kind of nothing. So maybe it's about creating use, creating necessity.
Well, Jean Piaget talked about our first language acquisition as being important and very different than second language acquisition, because in our first language, we're constructing our identity. We are determining who we are as a person when we speak this and enter into the community of our parents. And I think that learning a second language, for me, the biggest motivation to learning Portuguese and Piraha was to acquire new identities, to be seen as a Brazilian, to be seen as a Piraha. Those are kind of unrealistic goals because, I don't look like a Piraha any more than an apple looks like a cucumber. But I'm doing my best to identify with them because they were a very important part of my life. So that was a huge motivation. My life goals depended on me learning that language. And Portuguese, my life goals depended on me becoming as Brazilian as possible. So I took great satisfaction from that. But for most people, those motivations aren't so strong. If you're a businessman and you're speaking Portuguese, living in the United States, you can hire someone as a translator, but that it just makes you look inferior, and everybody knows that, to make money, you've got to speak English. So the motivation is there. On the other hand, an American businessman in Brazil will use a translator and rarely will learn Portuguese because they speak the language, that everybody currently wants. So the motivation, even though they're businessmen in each other's countries, the motivation is highly biased towards learning English and not learning Portuguese.
Now I can see why you feel kind of a little bit pessimistic about the future of, let's say, potentially thousands of these smaller languages.
Yeah, I think that linguists have taken on a challenge to try to preserve them, but these languages are not like endangered animals. It's not like we're trying to save a bird species when we're trying to save a language. Because the languages are spoken by intelligent creatures who have their own motives and their own intentions and their own goals for life. And the actions of trying to preserve their language most of the time are going to be weaker than the individual's own values, which will be to learn the other language. And it's going to be very difficult. Community pride is a good motivation. You see languages around the world where people are trying to revive their languages. But the only one that's been, genuinely successful that I know of is Hebrew, modern Hebrew, which is not the same as ancient Hebrew, but, and we also had for many years, we had Latin preserved in the Mass. So I suppose, priests could probably talk to each other in Latin. I don't know if that's true or not. But, with the absence of Latin from the Mass, what's the motivation? I don't know how many, priests probably have to take Latin. I had to take Koine Greek to be able to translate the New Testament. And I still like the fact that I can, pick up the New Testament in Greek. And although I've lost a lot of the vocabulary because I don't read Greek every day, I don't know any, I don't have any native speaker friends of Koine Greek, which hasn't been spoken for over 1,000 years. So the languages, the languages were very important. Jesus didn't speak Hebrew; he spoke Aramaic because that was the language spoken at the time in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I've actually been working on a video about the history of English teaching methods, and when you look through the when you look through the history of English teaching methods, it's kind of obvious how the methods that were used reflected the needs of the people at that time. So, when you go back far enough in history to people like Cleopatra, and there was a Greek emperor called Mithridates, and he, they spoke multiple languages because they were rulers of various kingdoms that spoke these languages. And then after that, it moved towards, the classical period where people were trying to, do stuff like translate texts into Latin and Greek. So, they focused on methods that were about those skills. And, so it seems like maybe you could say it's pessimistic, maybe you could say it's realistic, but, in today's modern world, the way we're all connected and the way we live, maybe we just don't have a need for 7,000 different languages.
Well, yes. I mean, and it depends on how you define need. There are various needs and there are various values, and they're ranked. So if you take economics and say that's a value, okay, so it's a value to thrive economically in the world, and you say it's a value to maintain your heritage. But which one is ranked the highest? If maintaining your heritage is ranked higher than economics, you're willing to take a lower wage and do something more traditional to maintain your heritage. But if economics is a higher value than heritage, well, your heritage is going to suffer as a result of it. And everybody is after greater comfort. Everybody wants to have as much leisure as they can. When I say everybody, I'm obviously overgeneralizing, but most people want to have leisure. They don't want to work hard from morning till night. And they want to have technology. They want to listen to music. They want to play video games. Not me, but a lot of people do. I'd like to think they want to buy books and contemplate philosophy, but that's just not the way it works. So the values are going to be skewed in favor of the economics almost in every case. And if you're trying to teach people to read and write a language that's disappearing, there's got to be a huge value. Obviously, the people who migrated to Israel after the Second World War had a huge motivation for identifying themselves as Jews and no longer as Germans and Polish and other nationalities. The diaspora, as it returned back to Israel, people sought their traditional identity in a way that just about no other culture has experienced in human history. So there was a motivation that was unique in the history of the world, and it paid off in these, through the story of modern Hebrew is an amazing story. But one of the reasons it's amazing is because it's so rare, it's unique.
So we've been talking a lot about the idea of either reincarnating or saving existing languages, but the reality is that more than 50% of the world's population already speaks multiple languages. In fact, like being monolingual is not the majority situation. And we've you and I in this series we've talked a lot about how learning another language helps you to understand other cultures and broadens your mind in multiple ways. So what do you think are some ways that maybe we could convince some this massive percentage of monolingual Australians and monolingual British people, monolingual Americans to take up the hard work of learning another language?
Well, it's not going to happen because it's virtuous. I mean, they're not going to do it they're not going to do it just to become better citizens of the world and or altruistically or anything like that. I mean, You and I have learned other languages because it's to our economic advantage to do. Even though my initial, I didn't think of it in those terms when I did it, but in fact, was a large part of it. If you live in Europe, there are good careers to be had by speaking multiple languages, where you have all of these very strong cultures, economically strong. And so if you want to be in the European Parliament, it helps to speak other languages. If you want to be, a successful personality in Europe or a successful businessman, you've got to have access to the knowledge of these cultures through their languages. So there's strong motivation there. But if you live in Australia, or Kansas in the US, or some state that has very small number of Spanish speakers or other language speakers, he probably will have a lot of Mexican farm laborers, and so some Spanish would be good. But he's not going to learn Chinese just because he wants access to the rich cultural traditions of China.
well, actually, I know a guy who just married a Brazilian girl, and they have a baby together, and they're trying to raise the baby bilingual because they live in Australia. And he said to me that one of the most difficult aspects for him of learning Brazilian, coming from the point of view of an English speaker, is that he finds it really difficult to just find content to consume that's written in Portuguese.
Yes, there is plenty of content. I learned a lot of Portuguese by watching Brazilian television and living in Brazil. And I tell people, if you want to learn a language, you need to live in a community of speakers. If you don't need the language, you won't learn it. He might need it to talk to his wife, but if her English is good, he doesn't need it so much. He might need it to make her happy and show her that he loves her. But that ought to be plenty of motivation, but it probably isn't. So if you're not living surrounded by Brazilians, when I arrived in Brazil, I took my family off the missionary compound, and we moved into a small little Brazilian neighborhood and I used to pay people to come by and talk to me in Portuguese. That was their only job, was to come by and talk to me for an hour, and I paid them for that, only if they corrected me. If they didn't correct me, I said, I won't pay you if you don't correct me. That was important because I needed Portuguese to survive. If I didn't learn Portuguese, I couldn't do anything in the society. So it was a huge motivation. But if I were living in California and I had a girlfriend who was Brazilian, I don't think that would get me through Portuguese. I'd probably just try to use Spanish if I knew that. And if I didn't know that, I would give her English lessons.
No, there's a saying among English teachers that the two best places to learn the language are in the classroom or in the bedroom.
Yes. Yeah, but in the bedroom, you need a much more limited vocabulary.
True that.
So it's like, I had people visit us among the Piraha when I was a missionary there, and they would see me struggling to learn the language. And one guy said, I just don't understand why you don't teach them English. Wouldn't that be a lot faster? Just teach them English and give them the Bible in English. I said, if it's hard for me to learn Piraha, I'm just one guy, and I've got a PhD in linguistics. How hard would it be for this whole village to learn English? And then what would the purpose of it be? The whole motivation for me is that people need to be communicated with in their native tongue for the communication to be effective. Language is hard. It's the hardest thing we ever learn is our native language or any other language. Languages are just hard. It would be nice if Chomsky's statement that they're basically all the same language with little word differences were true, but in fact, a vast amount of culture that has to be acquired at the same time as you learn the language, knowing not just what something means, but what situation it's appropriate in. It is so complicated. The idea that people are going to learn to speak their native language and preserve it because it feels good. I like the idea, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, one sort of insight that I've had recently, just talking to some people who specialize in research about bilingualism and interlanguaging, multilingualism, is that if you speak more than one language, it's actually okay and it's actually fine and it's actually normal if one or more of your languages is actually kind of weak, and you can't do a lot of things in your second language. Like maybe in your second language, the only thing you can do is order a coffee, but that's okay because at least it's something. And I'm wondering if maybe that's a good approach for adults, rather than saying, look, it's really, really hard, but you know what, it's okay if you just order a coffee. That's something.
Yeah, I mean, if I lived in Germany for a year and I worked at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and they provided an English environment, and they provided such assistance that their goal was, so I just had to work. I didn't have to worry about learning German. So if I were taken back to German right now, and I could drink all the beer I want because I can order beer, but I'd struggle with a lot of other stuff. But on the other hand, it's very important. I agree with that. I think, something's better than nothing. You need to learn, make some effort to show them that you're people that you're trying, because if you don't even show people any interest in their language, if you're traveling, you're not showing them that they're important to you. So like I tell people who are business people who are saying, well, I'm going to go to China, but I don't need to learn Chinese because everybody speaks English. And I said, if you had to deal with a Chinese business person living in the US who only spoke to you through a translator, how close would that make you feel to that person? How well would you think you knew them? And wouldn't it be a great compliment to you if they were making this effort to learn English? We may not be able to master completely another language, but we can certainly make an effort to communicate somehow, some little bit in that language.
I don't know if you saw maybe in the news recently about Elon Musk and his comment about languages. Did you see that?
Oh yeah, that we're not gonna need them.
Yeah, within 5 years they'll be obsolete.
Yeah, that's stupid. There's nothing to say about that. That's an ignorant remark. It's like saying in 5 years we won't need feet.
Well, obviously the backlash was pretty intense from, well, not just from linguists, but from basically from most people on the planet who saw the ridiculousness of that of that comment. But the reason he said it is because he's got this company called Neuralink, and they're working on an interface, a direct interface between devices and the brain, and I'm wondering like on a social level, what is that going to be like for you to be kind of maybe just standing in front of someone and transmitting thoughts almost telepathically? I mean, isn't that kind of creepy?
It takes a great deal of focus, so yeah, it's very creepy. I mean, most of the thoughts that go through my brain are filthy. So I wouldn't want people to know these things. I'm telling totally inappropriate jokes to myself the whole time I'm talking to somebody. So I would not want them to know.
This is a good point, actually.
Yeah. I mean, all the politically incorrect trash that goes through our brains. I used to tell when I was a dean, and I would tell faculty, I said, you can't always control what goes through your brain, but I can control what comes out your mouth. So how, you've got to, there's so many things to think about. We communicate with our bodies, not with our brains. So it's the gestures. What do the gestures mean? What do the facial expressions mean? Language is so much more than just word grammar. This is the computational view of language, which is just silly. I mean, so Elon Musk, he's got a lot of wacko ideas, and some of them really off. You need somebody to just spew out ideas like this, but nobody needs to think that in 5 years we can just wear helmets and everybody will know what everybody else is thinking. That's never going to happen.
The layperson would kind of say, well, Google Translate's pretty good, and so I can imagine that in 10 years I'll just kind of put a little thing in my ear and I can say whatever I want, and then it will be translated, into your ear. But as you said, it's like, it's not just words, right? Because it's the words that are appropriate for that culture. and the gestures and everything. Like, yeah.
There's also the fact that in our brains there are no words, right? Um, they come out of our mouth as words, but in our brains they're neuronal firings. It's electricity and chemistry in our brains. There's no words, there's no tree structures, there's no sentences in our brain. Um, and so people who say, the brain has these relationships among words as tree. I reviewed a book years ago called The Language Organ, and they said they were studying the brain. I said, if you were really studying the brain, you would be able to see syntactic tree structures in CAT scans, but you can't see those because they're not there. These are constructs that enable, they're what Peirce would call icons, to help us talk about properties of the brain that are actually in a very different form. So a tree structure corresponds to things we might know in the brain, but we don't know how we know it. We know so little about language. Evelina Fedorenko's work is one of the most advanced there is, and she can basically tell us where things are found in the brain, but nobody can tell us what does John sees Mary look like exactly in the brain. Nobody knows this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It seems, well, it's just too much of an abstraction. And in fact, I remember when she was telling me about how some people store language on one side of their brain and others on the other, and some people store language in both hemispheres. And I mean, that's pretty insane when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, those people probably have an advantage. They can take damage to one side of their brain and still maintain their language intact. Children can move it around if they get damage to what she has called the language network prior to learning the language. They'll still be able to learn their language. But if you suffer damage to that network after you've learned your language, then a lot of it is lost, because now we've reported our brain is plastic, and it loses a certain degree of plasticity over time. All learning is a form of brain plasticity, but once something is learned, there's less plasticity there in most cases. So these are science fiction ideas that have been around for a long time. Elon Musk is not the first person to say this. Mental telepathy has been a popular concept for a long time, and yet we don't even know what that would be. Nobody knows what that would entail, and how you would keep the bad thoughts out and only have the good thoughts in. It's highly unlikely.
It's so funny because when when I read the idea about his device, it never occurred to me that, of course, how would you filter out all of the stuff that you don't want to say but is still crossing your mind?
Yeah, it's a problem. There's also the fact that if somebody's talking to you, you could be thinking about the last movie you saw and just nodding and saying, uh-huh. We don't listen that well, and we say things that aren't connected that well, and we use a lot of scripts. We hear word X, and so we say sentence Y. There's no real thought going on there. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. It's like a physical reflex action. So, a lot of language doesn't take a lot of thought. I would have to know what he thinks language is, what he thinks he's trying to do, and I suspect that after 5 years, we're going to be no closer than we were 100 years ago to this.
Just to finish up, well, at the beginning you said you were kind of pessimistic about perhaps the future of a majority of the languages in the world. But if you were to write an argument, if you were to sit down and try and explain why we should, if it's possible, save them, what would you say?
Well, I would say that what I've already said, that is, languages are people's identity. It's what makes them unique from other people, distinct from. So the Pitahas, if they lose their language, they're no longer Pitahas. They're Brazilians, and they're not Brazilians at the highest rung of the Brazilian social ladder. They're Brazilians at the lowest rung. So right now they have great autonomy and self-worth and confidence as a culture. Take away their language and they're dependent on another culture, and they enter that culture at the bottom rung. And the history of indigenous peoples of Brazil, so for example, the Salesian missionaries trained lots of and not just the Salesians. In the past, it's been many missionaries who've prohibited the use of indigenous languages, made people learn Portuguese, given them skills, and think that now they're going to be a lot better off. They don't have to live in the jungle. They've got skills in the city. So at one time it was estimated that, these families that moved to Manaus, a lot of them moved to Manaus, that, there were like 10,000 estimated prostitutes in Manaus who were women from these indigenous communities who couldn't find work sewing. They couldn't get the job because they were indigenous, and nobody wanted to hire them. And they were out of their villages now, and they had nothing else to turn to. The guys who came down with mechanical skills, learning how to repair outboard motors and carpentry, that would have been quite valuable. There's still the racism that keeps them at the bottom. So losing their language and losing their cultural autonomy was disastrous for them and led to horrible consequences. This has been the case throughout the world, wherever indigenous people have had to learn languages against their will and then be relegated from the top of their own social ladder to the bottom of somebody else's social ladder. So that's one reason to allow people to keep their languages for as long as they want to. And they often want to learn Portuguese, for example, in Brazil, without knowing what those consequences are. They've never had that much contact with Brazilians, so they don't realize, what racism is all about. And there's racism in every country. Every group has some sort of racism, putting other groups down. American indigenous peoples in the United States have, one of the saddest histories in the world, one of the greatest forms of ethnocide, genocide in world history, from U.S. presidents, Andrew Jackson, just everybody. So learning languages, keeping their languages is important for their cultural integrity and their well-being. It's also important for us because of the things that it preserves of the world and the way the world can be classified, and the factual knowledge of all their environment that we would lose if we lost that language. So there are a lot of very compelling reasons to defend the autonomy of indigenous groups and the preservation of their languages. Those are values. Those values tend to be far lower on the totem pole of values than economics. And even the people that come from those groups are willing to undergo the racism very often in order to have a refrigerator. So these are, as bizarre as it sounds to us, I'm not willing to give up my refrigerator just now either. So these are, these sound like they're giving away their heritage for trinkets. There's a story in the Bible about Jacob and Esau, and Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob wanted all of his benefits, and so he tricked him into signing them away because Esau was very hungry, and Jacob had a pot of lentils, and so he traded away this expression. He traded away his heritage for a pot of lentils. This is very often what happens when people make the decision to give up their language and learn the language of the dominant culture. It's very unfortunate, but once it's done, it's done.
Yeah, I've had some really interesting conversations recently that have kind of shown me the importance of language in creating your identity, but also I think for me a new thing that I've learned is also how this identity, how the language you speak can also create trust, or even or on the other hand can actually break trust. So like, when you present yourself to a community with a specific accent, for example, using specific vocabulary, you're either including yourself or excluding yourself in that group when you try to enter it.
Yes, I mean that's one of the primary motivating factors behind the entire field of sociolinguistics. You see that people judge you based on how you speak. Southern dialect in the United States is seen as stupid. Manhattan dialect is seen as elitist. California dialect is seen as fairly vanilla. Basically, language is this phenomenal nexus of culture and grammar and semiotics, and it's so complicated and so engaged with who we are, with our identity, this identity that we've constructed, that we don't survive well without it, especially those of us who've learned a language. If we were forced to start speaking another language right now and never be able to use our native language, which is the case of many people in the world, it would be devastating to our psyche.